The first time my brother told me our father's house had been sold, I thought he was trying to scare me. Then he slid the settlement statement across the kitchen table. My name wasn't on it. Neither was my signature. And somehow, the house my father had spent 42 years paying for had apparently changed hands without me knowing. I stared at the paper for so long that my brother finally said, "You need to accept that Dad is gone, Daniel. This is what happens now." I looked up at him. What happens now? He sighed like I was the one making things difficult. We move on. That sentence stayed with me for years. Not because it was wise. Because eventually, I learned exactly what my brother had meant when he said it. And I learned that the house hadn't been the only thing he had been trying to take from me. Before I tell you what happened, if you enjoy realistic stories about betrayal, family secrets, karma, and justice, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Royal Revenge Stories. It really helps the channel, and it lets us keep bringing you stories where patience matters more than anger. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 39 when all of this happened. At the time, I lived in Columbus, Ohio, where I worked as a maintenance supervisor for a company that managed apartment buildings. It wasn't glamorous work, but I liked it. I knew how to fix things, I liked solving problems, and I had the kind of job where people only noticed you when something stopped working. My older brother, Mark, was 4 years older than me. Growing up, we had never been enemies. That is probably the part people have the hardest time understanding. When I tell this story now, people sometimes assume Mark must have always been selfish. That there must have been warning signs going back to childhood. There weren't. At least not obvious ones. Mark was the confident brother. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave 10 minutes later knowing everyone's name. He was good at talking to people, good at making connections, and very good at making his decisions sound like they had already been approved by everyone else. I was different. I preferred quiet. If there was an argument, I usually tried to find a way around it rather than through it. That difference between us had never mattered much when our parents were alive. It mattered after they were gone. Our father, Robert Mercer, had bought the house in 1979. It sat on a quiet street about 20 minutes outside Columbus, on a lot that was much larger than most of the newer houses around it. There was nothing luxurious about it. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a basement that always smelled faintly of sawdust, a detached garage where Dad kept tools he hadn't used in 20 years. The kitchen cabinets were older than I was. But that house was where everything happened. My parents had raised us there. We had celebrated birthdays there. We had argued there. I had learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Mark had brought his first girlfriend home there. Our mother had planted roses along the front walkway even though Dad complained every spring that the thorns were impossible to deal with. After Mom died, Dad stayed there alone. He refused to move. We tried convincing him. Mark suggested an apartment. I suggested a smaller house. Dad wouldn't hear either idea. He would stand in the kitchen, pour himself coffee, and say the same thing. "I'm not moving. Your mother is here." He didn't mean that literally. He meant her memories were there. Eventually, we stopped arguing. After Dad retired, I started visiting him every Saturday. Sometimes I would fix something around the house. Sometimes we'd go grocery shopping. Sometimes we'd sit on the back porch and talk about absolutely nothing. Mark visited too, but less regularly. He lived about 45 minutes away and had started a small property management business with a friend. At least that's what he told us. He always seemed busy. Phone calls, clients, repairs, meetings, tenants. There was always something. Dad never complained. In fact, Dad defended him. "Mark is building something," he'd say. "Give him time." I used to smile whenever Dad said that. I never imagined those words would eventually become important. The last 6 months of Dad's life were difficult. His health had deteriorated quickly. One week he was mowing the lawn. A few months later, he struggled to walk from the bedroom to the kitchen. During that period, Mark and I started taking turns helping him. I handled most of the medical appointments because my schedule was more flexible. Mark handled bills and some of the paperwork. At the time, I was grateful. I didn't want to deal with paperwork. Mark seemed comfortable with it. That arrangement was the first mistake I ever made. But I didn't know it was a mistake then. Dad died on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. He was 78. I was sitting beside his hospital bed when it happened. Mark arrived about 20 minutes later. I remember him standing in the doorway. He looked at Dad, then at me. Neither of us said anything. There are some moments when words simply don't belong. We buried Dad 5 days later. After the funeral, we went back to the house. For the first time in my life, it felt completely different. The furniture was still there. Dad's coffee mug was still beside the sink. His old jacket was hanging behind the kitchen door. But he wasn't. That silence was worse than the funeral. I stood in the kitchen and stared at the refrigerator. There was still a grocery list held to it with a magnet. Milk, bread, coffee, apples. For simple things. Things Dad would never need again. Mark came up beside me. "We'll figure everything out," he said. I nodded. "What happens to the house?" He looked at me. "Eventually, we'll sell it." I wasn't ready for that. Eventually? Daniel, what are we going to do with it? I looked through the window toward the backyard. I don't know. Mark put his hands in his pockets. Neither do I. That's why we shouldn't rush. At the time, I thought that was a reasonable answer. A few weeks later, the first strange thing happened. Mark asked me for a copy of my driver's license. I was standing in Dad's garage when he called. Why? For the estate paperwork. What paperwork? Probate stuff. I laughed. You're asking me for my driver's license for probate? That's what they asked for. Who? There was a pause. Then he said, the attorney. What attorney? Another pause. Daniel, seriously? His voice changed. Not much, but enough. I've been handling this because somebody has to. I felt guilty immediately. Okay, sorry. Just send it to me. I did. I didn't think about it again. Then another month passed. Mark started visiting the house more often. First, I was glad. I thought he was helping. Then I noticed things were disappearing. Nothing valuable. At least not obviously. Dad's old toolbox was gone. So was the wooden desk from the upstairs bedroom. One of the antique lamps Mom had bought years ago wasn't there anymore. I called Mark. Did you take Dad's desk? Yeah. Why? Because nobody was using it. You could have asked. He laughed. Daniel, it's a desk. I didn't respond. He sighed. Look, if you want something, take it. We're going to have to clean this place out eventually. That sounded reasonable. Again, I should probably tell you something about myself. I was always the person who assumed there was an innocent explanation. If someone didn't answer my message, they were busy. If someone sounded annoyed, they were having a bad day. If someone forgot something, they forgot. It took me a long time to understand that being trusting and being naive are not the same thing. But they can look very similar until someone takes advantage of you. In December, Mark called me again. Have you found Dad's will? I was surprised. No. I thought you had it. I don't. You sure? Yes. He was quiet. Then he said, that's a problem. What kind of problem? I'll figure it out. Mark. What? What exactly are you looking for? Nothing. I'll call you later. He hung up. That was the first time I felt something I couldn't explain. Not fear. Not anger. Just a small sense that I was no longer being told everything. A week later, Mark came to my apartment. He had a folder with him. He put it on my kitchen table. I found some of Dad's estate documents. I opened the folder. There were bank statements, insurance paperwork, tax documents, a copy of Dad's death certificate. Then I saw something that made me stop. Property document. I looked at Mark. What is this? Nothing. It has the house address. I know. I read the first page. It was some kind of transfer document. I didn't understand the legal language. What does this mean? Mark pulled out a chair. It means we can sell the house. Why does it say your name? He stared at me. What? I pointed at the page. There was his name. And Dad's. But mine wasn't there. Mark leaned back. It's complicated. Then explain it. He rubbed his forehead. Dad transferred part of the property to me before he died. I stared at him. When? I don't remember exactly. You don't remember? Daniel, it was paperwork. Dad wanted me to handle things. That doesn't answer my question. He stood. You're making this more dramatic than it is. Did Dad give you the house? No. Then why is your name on this? Because I was helping him. I picked up the document again. Something about it bothered me. The date was almost 2 years before Dad died. I looked at Mark. Why didn't Dad ever tell me? Mark shrugged. I don't know. That answer hurt more than I expected. Dad had never been secretive with me. At least I thought he hadn't. I called Mark later that night. I'm going to talk to Dad's attorney. You don't need to. I think I do. Daniel. What? Don't turn this into a fight. I almost laughed. A fight? I'm asking about my father's house. He's gone. I know he's gone. Then respect what he wanted. That stopped me. What did he want? Mark didn't answer. He just said, I'll call you tomorrow. He never did. 3 days later, I received an email from a title company. The subject line was simple. Property closing documents. Mercer residence. I opened it. My hands went cold. There was a scheduled closing date. The house was being sold. The buyer's name was unfamiliar. The sale price was far higher than I expected. I called Mark immediately. He answered on the 4th ring. Hello. What is this? Silence. The closing. You're selling Dad's house? We're selling the house. No. You are. Daniel, we talked about this. No, we didn't. Yes, we did. When? He exhaled. I'm not doing this over the phone. Then tell me where you are. Why? Because I'm coming over. Don't. That single word stopped me. Why? Because you're angry. I have every right to be angry. Just calm down. I stared at the email. How can you sell a house that belongs to both of us? Mark's voice became quieter. It doesn't. I felt something drop inside my chest. What? The house doesn't belong to both of us. You just said Dad transferred part of it to you. He transferred all of it. I couldn't speak. Mark continued. Dad signed everything before he got sick. You weren't involved because you didn't need to be. Where is the document? You've already seen it. No. I saw one document. I want the complete file. Why? Because I don't believe you. He went silent. Then he said something I will never forget. You should have trusted me when Dad was alive. The line went dead. I sat at my kitchen table for almost an hour. I kept looking at the email. Then I opened the attachment again. The document Mark had shown me was there. I zoomed in. The first page showed the property address. The second page showed signatures. Dad's signature. A witness signature. And Mark's name. I read the date again. Then I noticed something. The document wasn't the original transfer. It was a copy. And in the bottom corner, almost hidden beneath a scanned stamp, there was a handwritten notation. I enlarged it. 3 words. See attached schedule. I leaned closer to the screen. Attached schedule? There wasn't one. I checked the entire email. Nothing. I checked the folder Mark had given me. Nothing. For the first time since Dad died, I stopped thinking about whether my brother was lying. I started wondering what he was hiding. The next morning, I called the county recorder's office. I didn't tell them my whole story. I simply gave them the property address and asked whether I could obtain the recorded documents connected to the house. The woman on the phone asked me to hold. When she came back, her voice had changed. Mr. Mercer? Yes. I found the transfer document you're asking about. My stomach tightened. Okay. There are actually 2 recordings associated with that transaction. I sat up. 2. Yes. What does the second one say? There was a pause. Then she said, the second document contains an attachment that isn't included in the copy you described. I gripped the edge of the table. What attachment? I can't interpret the legal meaning for you. I understand. But I can tell you what the document says. My heart was pounding. What does it say? She read the notation slowly, and when she finished, I realized that my brother hadn't simply forgotten one document. He had been counting on me never finding it, because that missing page contained the one thing that could change everything. And suddenly, I understood why Mark had been so confident. He didn't think I would look. He thought I would trust him, just like I always had. The woman at the recorder's office read the final line again. Then she said, "There is a condition attached to the transfer." What condition? She hesitated. "I'm not an attorney, Mr. Mercer. I don't want to interpret it for you. I understand. I just need to know what the document says." She read it slowly. "The property is transferred subject to the retained ownership interest described in Schedule B." I wrote the words down. Schedule B. Yes. Is Schedule B attached to the recorded document? It should be. But you said there were 2 recordings. There are. I could hear papers moving on her end. "Mr. Mercer, I think you need to request certified copies of both. Can I do that today?" "Yes." I thanked her and hung up. For several seconds I just sat there. I didn't feel relieved. Not yet. I felt something more dangerous. Hope. And hope can make you careless if you let it. So I forced myself not to call Mark. Instead, I drove downtown and requested the certified copies. Took almost an hour. When the clerk finally handed me the envelope, I didn't open it at the counter. I carried it back to my truck. I sat behind the steering wheel with the envelope on my lap. My hands were shaking slightly. I kept thinking about Dad, about the house, about Mark telling me that I should have trusted him. Then I opened the envelope. The first document was the same transfer I'd already seen. Dad's name, Mark's name, the property address. Then I reached the second document. It was several pages longer, and halfway through it I found Schedule B. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The words were written in formal legal language, but the meaning was simple enough. Dad had not transferred the entire property to Mark. He had transferred an interest in the property while retaining another interest for his estate. And there was something else. The document specifically referenced both sons, me and Mark. I leaned back against the seat. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But then I noticed the date. The document had been signed nearly 18 months before Dad died, which meant Mark had known about it. Maybe Dad had told him. Maybe the attorney had. Either way, Mark couldn't honestly say he had no idea. I called the attorney listed on Dad's old paperwork. A woman named Elaine Porter answered. When I explained who I was, she became very quiet. Then she said, "Daniel, I was wondering when you'd call." That sentence made my stomach tighten. "Why?" "Because your father was very specific about one thing." "What thing?" "He didn't want the house sold without both sons being involved." I closed my eyes. Did Dad transfer the house to Mark? No. Then why did Mark tell me he did? I can't answer for your brother. Did Dad sign the document? Yes. Did he understand it? Yes. And did he leave instructions about the property? Yes. What instructions? She paused. "Daniel, I'd rather have you come into the office." "Why?" "Because there are things I don't want to explain over the phone." I looked through my windshield. The sky was gray. I had spent the entire morning expecting to find out that I had no rights. Instead, I was beginning to realize that I might have been deliberately kept in the dark. I made an appointment for the next morning. Before I left the parking lot, I finally called Mark. He answered quickly. "Where are you?" "Why?" "You've been calling around." I froze. "How do you know?" "Because Elaine called me." I hadn't told Elaine that I was going to see her, so she must have contacted him after receiving my call. "I have a question," I said. "What?" "What's Schedule B?" Silence. Not hesitation. Silence. The kind of silence that tells you you've touched something important. Then Mark said, "You went digging." "I asked for the public records." "You don't know what you're looking at." "Then explain it." "You're going to make a mess of this." "What mess?" "You're going to stop the sale." I stared at the steering wheel. "So you admit there's a problem?" "I didn't say that." You just said I could stop the sale. Daniel, listen to me. No. You listened to me. It was the first time I had raised my voice at him since Dad died. You told me Dad gave you the house. He gave me control. That isn't what the document says. You don't understand the document. Then why were you hiding Schedule B? I wasn't hiding anything. Then why didn't you give it to me? He didn't answer. Mark, I have to go. He hung up. I sat there for another minute. Then I noticed something strange. A text message had arrived from an unknown number. It said, "You need to ask Mark why the buyer was shown a different version of the paperwork." I read it twice. There was no name, no explanation, just that one sentence. I almost deleted it. Instead, I took a screenshot. That decision would later become important. The next morning, I met Elaine Porter at her office. She was in her late 50s, calm, precise, and not particularly interested in family drama. She put a thick folder on the desk. "This is everything I can legally provide. Why?" "Oh, you." I looked at the folder. "Did Dad leave a will?" "Yes." "Did Mark know about it?" "Yes." "Did you tell him about Schedule B?" "Yes." I looked at her. "When?" "After your father's death." "So he knew." "He was present when we reviewed the estate documents." I felt my jaw tighten. "Why didn't anyone call me?" Elaine frowned. "I thought you were informed." "By who?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Your brother told us he was communicating with you." I laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because suddenly so many little things made sense. The missing documents, the vague phone calls, the requests for my identification, the pressure to move quickly. Mark hadn't simply been handling paperwork. He had been positioning himself as the person who spoke for both of us. Elaine opened another file. "There is one more thing." "What?" "Your father amended his estate instructions about 6 months before he died." My stomach tightened. Amended them how? "He wanted the house preserved until both sons agreed on what happened to it." I stared at her. "Why?" "He was worried about conflict." I almost smiled. Dad had worried about exactly the thing that had happened. "What did he say about selling?" Elaine looked down at the document. "Your father wrote that neither son was to sell, transfer, mortgage, or otherwise dispose of his interest without written consent from the other." I sat back. That was it. That was the missing piece. Not a loophole. Not some technical trick. Dad had deliberately protected both of us. Mark had tried to turn that protection into a secret. I asked Elaine the question that had been sitting in my mind since the moment I arrived. "Can Mark sell the house without my signature?" She was careful with her answer. "Based on the documents I've reviewed, I don't believe he has the authority to convey full title without addressing your retained interest." "So the sale isn't valid?" "That's not something I can determine for you. But he can't just sell it." "Not cleanly." That phrase stuck with me. Not cleanly. I looked at the folder. "Who is the buyer?" Elaine gave me the name. Thomas Reed. I recognized it. Not personally. But the name was connected to a local investment company. "What does he know?" "I don't know." "Can we find out?" "You can." I left her office with copies of everything I was entitled to receive. I didn't call Mark. I didn't call the buyer. I didn't threaten anyone. I went home. Then I did something I should have done weeks earlier. I made a timeline. I wrote down every conversation I could remember. Every document Mark had requested. Every time he'd said something about the house. Every time he'd claimed Dad wanted something. Every date. Every email. Every text. By the time I finished, I had filled 6 pages. And one pattern was impossible to ignore. Mark had started pushing for the sale almost immediately after Dad's funeral. At first, he'd said the house needed to be sold eventually. Then he'd said it was costing too much to maintain. Then he'd said the buyer was already interested. Then he'd said there was no reason for me to delay. But he had never once told me that Dad's estate documents required both of us to agree. That wasn't an omission anymore. It looked deliberate. 2 days later, I received another message from the unknown number. This time it contained a photo. It was a screenshot of an email. The email was from Mark to the title company. The subject line read, "Mercer Property Authority to Sell." The message was short. Mark had written that he was the sole authorized owner of the property and that his brother had no remaining ownership interest. I stared at the screen. He had put it in writing. My first reaction was anger. My second was fear. Because now this wasn't just a family argument. There were professionals involved. A buyer, a title company, money, closing documents, deadlines. I forwarded the screenshot to Elaine. She called me within 10 minutes. "Where did you get this?" "I don't know." "What do you mean?" "Someone sent it to me anonymously." She was quiet. "Daniel, don't forward this to your brother." "I wasn't planning to." "Good. Why?" "Because if this is authentic, you need to preserve the original evidence." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "What do I do?" "Talk to a property attorney." So I did. The attorney was named Michael Hayes. He was recommended by a colleague of mine at work. I brought him every document I had. He spent nearly 2 hours going through them. At one point, he looked at me and said, "Your brother made a very risky assumption." "What assumption?" "That you wouldn't challenge him." I swallowed. "Can he sell the house?" "Not the way he's trying to." "What happens to the buyer?" "That depends on what the buyer knew and when they knew it." I looked at the floor. "So if the buyer didn't know? They may have their own claims. And if they did know?" Michael closed the folder. "Then the situation becomes much more complicated for your brother." I thought about the anonymous messages. "Can we find out?" "Yes." "How?" "Start with the title company." Michael explained what he wanted me to do. No threats, no accusations, no dramatic confrontation, just written communication. Everything documented. I followed his advice. I sent a formal notice stating that I disputed the claim that my ownership interest had been extinguished and that I did not consent to the sale. I attached the relevant recorded documents. Then I waited. For the first time since Dad died, I wasn't chasing Mark. I was letting the paperwork speak. 3 days later, the title company contacted Michael. The closing had been paused. I read the email twice. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. But it lasted less than an hour. Because that afternoon, Mark showed up at my apartment. He didn't call first. He didn't text. He simply stood outside my door. When I opened it, he looked exhausted. "Can I come in?" I hesitated. Then I stepped aside. He walked into the living room. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he said, "You stopped the sale." "I disputed the sale." "You knew exactly what you were doing." "Yes." He looked at me differently. Not like a younger brother anymore. Like an opponent. "Do you have any idea how much money is involved?" "I know how much Dad's house is worth." "You're going to destroy everything." "No, Mark." I looked directly at him. "You already did that." His face tightened. "You think this is about the house, isn't it?" "No." He sat down. For the first time, I saw something behind his anger. Fear. Real fear. "What is it about?" I asked. He rubbed his hands together. "I borrowed money." My stomach dropped. "How much?" He didn't answer. "Mark." "Enough." "From who?" "Private lenders." "Why?" He looked away. "My business." I understood then. The house wasn't simply something he wanted to sell. It was something he needed to sell. "What did you do?" "I had debts." "How much?" "More than I could cover." "And you planned to pay them with Dad's house." "I planned to solve the problem." "You planned to sell something that wasn't entirely yours." His eyes hardened. "You weren't doing anything with it. That doesn't make it yours." "I needed help." "You should have asked." He laughed bitterly. "Would you have given me money?" I didn't answer. He nodded. "Exactly. Maybe I would have." "No, Daniel. You wouldn't." He stood up. Then he said something that made the room go quiet. "You don't understand what happens if this sale doesn't close." "What happens?" He looked at me. "My business collapses." I expected that to make me feel sorry for him. Instead, I remembered Dad's house, the kitchen, the roses, the old coffee mug, and I remembered Mark telling me I should trust him. I said quietly, "That's not my fault." He stared at me. "No." Then his voice became colder. "But don't pretend this ends with the house." "What does that mean?" He walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around. "You're going to wish you had let me sell it." Then he left. I stood there listening to his footsteps disappear down the hallway. I thought the worst part was over. I was wrong. The next morning, Michael called me. "Daniel, there's something you need to know." "What?" "The buyer's attorney sent us a copy of the documents Mark provided during negotiations." I sat down. "Okay. There is a second version of the transfer paperwork." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Your brother appears to have given them a document that makes his ownership interest look much broader than the recorded version." I couldn't speak. Then Michael added something even more disturbing. "The document isn't simply missing Schedule B." "What is it?" "It appears to have been altered." I stared at the wall. Mark hadn't merely hidden a document. He had apparently created a version of the paperwork that told a different story. And now there was only one question I couldn't stop thinking about. Who had helped him? Because my brother might have been reckless. He might have been desperate. But altering property documents and misleading a title company was far beyond the kind of mistake someone makes by accident. And if someone else was involved, I had a feeling we hadn't even reached the real betrayal yet. I barely slept that night. Not because I was afraid of losing the house. By then, I knew the documents were on my side. I was afraid of what I might discover next. Michael had told me not to confront Mark. "Let the professionals handle the communication," he said. "Your job is to preserve everything." So I did. I gathered every text message, every email, every document Mark had sent me, even the casual messages I had never thought twice about. Then I remembered something. The text from the unknown number. "You need to ask Mark why the buyer was shown a different version of the paperwork." I showed it to Michael. He studied it. "Don't respond." I wasn't going to. "Good. Do you think it's the buyer?" "Maybe. Or someone at the title company?" "Maybe. Or someone who worked with Mark?" Michael nodded. "That would be my concern." 2 days later, we received an answer. The altered document had not come directly from Mark's personal email. It had been submitted through a broker who had been helping arrange the sale. The broker was named Stephen Cole. Michael requested records from the title company showing the chain of documents they had received. And there it was. Mark had first provided the broker with a copy of the transfer. Then, several days later, he had sent an updated version. The second version removed the section referencing my retained interest. That was the moment everything changed. Until then, I had been trying to understand why my brother would risk selling the house. Now I understood. He wasn't simply hoping nobody would notice. He had built his entire plan around nobody checking the original record. And he almost got away with it. Almost. The title company had initially relied on the documents Mark provided because they appeared complete. But once my attorney supplied the certified records, the discrepancy became obvious. The closing was officially suspended. The buyer demanded an explanation. And Mark's business partner, who had apparently known about the sale, suddenly stopped answering calls. That was when we discovered another piece of the puzzle. Mark's property business was in trouble long before Dad died. He had taken out loans against several investment properties. One of his biggest tenants had left. Another property needed major repairs. He had borrowed money from private lenders to cover shortfalls. The house wasn't supposed to be a windfall. It was supposed to be an emergency exit. He believed selling Dad's house would give him enough money to clear the debts and keep his business alive. That didn't excuse what he had done. But it finally explained it. Greed hadn't started the problem. Fear had. Greed had simply convinced him that I was the easiest person to sacrifice. A week later, Michael asked me to attend a meeting. Mark was there. So was his attorney. The title company's representative was there. The buyer's attorney was there. I remember sitting at that conference table and thinking about Dad. He had always hated arguments. He used to say, "If you have to raise your voice, you've already lost control of the conversation." I almost smiled, because Mark looked like he had forgotten that lesson. His attorney did most of the talking. He argued that Mark believed he had authority to sell. Michael responded with the recorded documents. Then he produced the original Schedule B. The room became very quiet. Mark looked at the page, then at me. "You went through Dad's files." "No." I looked at him. "I got the certified record." He stared at me. His face had gone pale. The title company representative compared the certified document with the version Mark had submitted. Then she said, "These are materially different." Mark's attorney turned toward him. "Did you submit this version?" Mark didn't answer. "Mr. Mercer?" Finally, Mark said, "I don't remember." That answer was almost unbelievable. His own attorney closed his eyes for a moment. The buyer's attorney leaned forward. "We have emails." Mark looked at him. "What emails?" "The ones your broker provided." Mark's expression changed. I realized then that he had believed everyone around him would protect him. But when the sale stopped benefiting them, they had no reason to keep protecting him. The broker had handed over his records. The title company had its own copies. The buyer had emails. And I had the original documents. Mark had walked into a room full of evidence. He just hadn't realized it yet. The meeting ended without a sale. The buyer withdrew. Not because of anything I had done. They simply didn't want to purchase a property tied up in an ownership dispute. That was the first real consequence Mark faced. But it wasn't the last. The lender who had been expecting the sale proceeds learned that the transaction had lapsed. Then Mark's business partner discovered that Mark had represented the property as available collateral. That relationship ended almost immediately. Within weeks, Mark's business began falling apart. Properties were sold. Employees left. His office closed. The private lenders started demanding repayment. And for the first time, Mark had nowhere to hide. But I still hadn't decided what to do about him personally. Michael asked me, "Do you want to pursue every available claim?" I looked at him. "What would you do?" He shook his head. "This isn't about what I would do." I thought about Dad. About what he would have wanted. I didn't want Mark ruined. I wanted the truth documented. There was a difference. So I told Michael I wanted the house handled according to Dad's estate instructions. Neither of us would sell it immediately. Neither of us would use it as collateral. And neither of us could make a decision about it without the other. For a while, I considered keeping it. But every room reminded me of the worst months of my life. So eventually, Mark and I agreed through our attorneys to sell it properly. This time, everything was transparent. Both of us signed. The buyer knew exactly what they were purchasing. The proceeds were divided according to our legal interests and the estate documents. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine, and I didn't give Mark anything that wasn't his. That was important to me, because I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth. There was one final surprise, though. A few weeks after the sale, I received another message from the unknown number. This time, the sender finally identified herself. It was the title company's junior clerk. Her name was Melissa. She had been the person who noticed that the document Mark originally submitted didn't match the recorded version. She had also been the person who sent me the first anonymous message. I called her. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" She laughed nervously. "Because I wasn't sure I was allowed to." "Why help me?" There was a pause. "Because I recognized your father's name." I was confused. "How?" "My mother knew your dad." I didn't know what to say. She explained that her mother had worked with Dad many years earlier. Apparently, Dad had once helped her when she was struggling financially. He hadn't given her money. He had simply recommended her for a job. That job had changed her life. Melissa had heard the Mercer name when she was reviewing the paperwork. She remembered her mother talking about my father. Then she saw the discrepancy, and she couldn't ignore it. It was a small connection. Nothing dramatic. No secret family relationship. No unbelievable coincidence. Just one person remembering a decent man and deciding that something about his estate didn't look right. That was enough. Months later, I went back to the house one last time. The buyer hadn't moved in yet. I had permission to collect the last few things. Dad's old coffee mug was still in the cabinet. I took it. I found Mom's gardening gloves in the shed. I took those too. Then I walked through the empty rooms. The house looked smaller. Maybe because I wasn't seeing it through childhood eyes anymore. I stood in the kitchen where Mark had once told me to trust him. And I realized something. For years, I had believed being a good brother meant avoiding conflict. I thought keeping the peace meant giving people the benefit of the doubt. I thought asking questions made me difficult. But there is a difference between peace and silence. Sometimes silence doesn't preserve a relationship. Sometimes it simply gives another person room to hurt you. Mark and I barely speak now. We aren't enemies. We don't scream at each other. We don't send angry messages. We simply live separate lives. I heard through relatives that he eventually closed the business completely and found work managing properties for another company. He paid back much of what he owed over time. He also had to deal with the consequences of the altered documents through the appropriate legal channels. I never celebrated that. I didn't want to, because by then, I understood something I hadn't understood when this began. Karma isn't always watching someone lose everything while you stand there smiling. Sometimes karma is much quieter. It's being forced to explain your own decisions. It's having people read the documents you thought nobody would see. It's losing the trust of people who once believed you. It's waking up one morning and realizing the person you betrayed isn't the one who destroyed your life. You did that yourself. I still think about Dad, especially when I use that old coffee mug. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never called the recorder's office. What if I had trusted Mark? What if I had signed something? What if I had accepted his explanation and walked away? I don't like thinking about those possibilities for too long, because the truth is, my brother didn't miss some magical loophole. He missed a document that existed because our father had anticipated exactly the kind of situation we eventually faced. Dad knew his sons were different. He knew Mark was more confident. He knew I was more trusting. And maybe that was why he made sure neither of us could make a major decision about the house alone. The document wasn't revenge. It wasn't a trap. It was simply my father's attempt to protect both of us from making decisions we might regret. Ironically, the only person who ignored that protection was the person who claimed to be carrying out Dad's wishes. And that is the part one think about most. My brother thought he was selling a house. He thought the only thing standing between him and the money was my willingness to cooperate. He was wrong. The thing standing between him and the money was the truth. And once the truth was documented, there was nothing I needed to do to destroy him. I only had to stop helping him hide from the consequences of his own choices. That experience changed me. I still help people. I still trust people. But I ask questions now. I read documents. I keep records. And when something doesn't make sense, I don't tell myself that I'm being paranoid just because the person I love is involved. Because sometimes the smallest detail is the one thing someone hoped you would never notice. And sometimes justice doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in an envelope, on a recorded page, with one missing attachment finally placed where it belonged. If you've ever been betrayed by someone in your own family, I'd genuinely like to know how you handled it. Would you have confronted Mark immediately? Would you have tried to forgive him? Or would you have done what I did and let the evidence speak for itself? If this story meant something to you, leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Royal Revenge Stories for more stories about betrayal, justice, and the consequences people create for themselves.